in 1859, Charles Darwin published his book, The Origin of Species. And if you paid any attention in high school, you know what The Origin of Species is. It changed a ton about science and evolution and nature and everything. It was this crazily defining thing. And part of that book was the Galapagos Islands and the way that evolution had manifested itself in the isolated environment of the Galapagos Islands. And I find it kind of fitting that 100 years later, the AFL started its own Galapagos Islands of sorts in football, its own isolated world where things evolved so differently. And this has something to do with the Vikings. Bear with me here, but it's going to be a weird one here on the Locked On Vikings podcast.
Ooh-wee! You are Locked On Vikings, your daily Minnesota Vikings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome to another edition of the Locked On Vikings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, your pal, and the kid you copied off in math class. My name is Luke Braun. You can find me on Twitter at Luke Braun NFL. Show is on Twitter at Locked On Vikings. And today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, ops, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. Thank you so much for making Locked On Vikings your first listen of the day. If I sound a little different than I usually do, echo-wise, it's because I moved and the room's about half set up, so it's very echoey in here. So my apologies for that if that's the kind of thing that bothers you. If you are watching on YouTube, then you already knew that because I look way different. There's a different backdrop. I got purple lights in the background. That's very cool, so enjoy that. And today is going to be a weird one. We're going to talk a little bit about history, but before we do that, let me catch you up. So the Galapagos Islands, this is something that I did a lot on early Locked On Vikings. So longtime listeners are familiar with this sort of episode where I take a very unrelated discipline and relate it to football. It's a thing. Bear with me. The Galapagos Islands are a very interesting place to the world of science because they were very isolated. They were these weird islands off the coast of like Ecuador, I think. And they had experienced evolution differently. And they are kind of propped up as one of the major things that made the theory of evolution like a widely accepted thing in the scientific community because the Galapagos Islands were isolated. Turtles were different there because turtles that needed to survive on the Galapagos Island had a different set of needs than turtles everywhere else. So turtles evolved to be different, and every species on the Galapagos experienced this. And so Charles Darwin went to the Galapagos Islands and charted everything out there and took a bunch of notes and turned it into a book. That book was The Origin of Species, and evolution and the theory of evolution and all of the like scientific disciplines around evolution totally took off. That was 1859. 100 years later, Lamar Hunt, who was very, very mad about not being able to join the exclusive boys club that was the NFL owners, decided he was going to make his own league with blackjack and hookers. And he did so. And he called guys like Bud Adams, and he actually called the Vikings and Max Winter and the original owners of the Vikings, who originally agreed to be part of it, but then backed out because they got a better offer from the NFL. And that's a whole different drama for another day. But they got a league together. It was an 8-team league, including the Bills and the Boston Patriots and the Broncos and the Raiders and the Dallas Texans, who would, after their first year, become the Kansas City Chiefs, and all those original AFL teams. And the AFL played for, I think, 5 or 6 years before ever playing an NFL team. So they evolved, much like the Galapagos, they evolved in their own personal kind of bubble. And in that bubble, different stuff got invented. The AFL, and you have to understand the kind of dynamics affecting the AFL too, because the AFL was in stark competition with the NFL. This wasn't an XFL situation or a USFL situation where, like, the XFL kind of has the tacit support of the NFL. The NFL, I think, understands that the XFL's existence is like pretty good for it. And they probably understand that the USFL is like probably going to be pretty good for it. And when it kicks off in April, I mean, I'm going to be all over it. I'm going to have a lot of fun with that. But like they probably understand that that's all kind of similar stuff. And with the AFL and the NFL back in the 1960s, it was bitter because like it was like personal. Like these guys hated Lamar Hunt, all the NFL Titans, the Hallases and the Rooneys and the Maras all hated Lamar Hunt. And Lamar Hunt then became a direct competitor, and it was like true beef. So for 5 or 6 years, the AFL and the NFL didn't speak, and the AFL was on its own, and it was trying to compete with the behemoth that the NFL already was. It was this fixture in homes on Sundays, and the AFL was trying to compete. And part of the way they did that was to kind of go Harlem Globetrotters about it, where like there was a lot more passing because passing was more fun. And while the NFL kind of did it the quote unquote right way, the AFL passed a lot more and had a lot more reverses and varied formations and more trick plays and more fun stuff. And that's why I say that kind of Harlem Globetrotters did, because it was very entertaining. It was a lot about being an entertainment product. And the way this relates to the Vikings, in a huge way, it relates to their first Super Bowl loss in 1969. And we're going to talk about that next. But it also kind of relates to the Vikings today because of the defense that they're adopting. And I want to talk about that too. But first, let me talk about the 1969 Super Bowl. Because I don't know. It's fun, man. We're Vikings fans. Let's talk about the first time they lost the Super Bowl. It was the last game between the AFL and NFL before the merger. The merger happened in 1970. This happened at the end of the 1969 season. And there had been 3 Super Bowls before this. AFL, NFL championship games. The 2 the Packers won and then the Joe Namath one. So it was 2-1 NFL versus AFL. So this was the AFL's chance to tie the series, and it would stay knotted up forever. Otherwise, it would be 3-1, and the NFL would kind of always have that edge over the AFL. So it was very important to them. It was very important to them for a bunch of reasons. Part of it was the Vikings balked on the AFL way back in the day, and Lamar Hunt was still mad about it. And part of it was just the kind of reputation, and that the Vikings were favored by 2 touchdowns in that game, and the AFL Chiefs were still kind of seen. It would be like an XFL team playing an NFL team right now, like the Houston Roughnecks of the XFL, who probably would have won the championship if that season had ended, going and playing an NFL team, but like not just a random one. Like go play the Rams at the end of the season, right? Go play the Super Bowl winners, or I guess it would have been the Bucks that season. Like go play the winners, and that, you know, you'd be favored by a lot. And so it was the Chiefs kind of, and everybody knew it, had less talent. They just didn't have, I mean, these were the 1969 Vikings. They had Alan Page and Carl Eller and Jim Marshall and Gary. They had the Purple People Eaters. They had Paul Krause back there. They had Joe Kapp throwing it to Gene Washington and Bill Brown and like all these crazy cool 1960s, 1970s Vikings that your dads all love. And the Chiefs didn't have, I mean, they had guys that are famous now that were, you know, Len Dawson and Bobby Bell and all these guys, but they weren't seen as that back then. Like they did not have that respect. And the reason that game, I mean, it was a 23-7 final score. It was a blowout. And a huge reason that went that way, that the Vikings could only muster 1 scoring drive the whole game, was the 3-4 defense. And a big reason the 3-4 defense evolved the way it did was the AFL. And even though it wasn't invented, 20 years before the AFL was a thought, it was the defense du jour in the AFL. And everybody ran it. And the Vikings had a pretty standard NFL run game that beat everybody else in the NFL. These very kind of monolithic, you have these 2 leagues that evolve over 10 years. I mean, this was 10 years of the AFL had happened. So a metagame had evolved. And the way the AFL played offense, the 3-4 defense was better against it. So teams adopted that 3-4 defense that the Oklahoma Sooners had done, 15, 20 years before. So everybody, so the Chiefs are playing a 3-4 defense, and a big part of a 3-4 defense back in those days was a big beefy nose tackle, a big old zero technique, big beefy guy. 267 was beefy back then. That dude would maybe be like a high-end linebacker now. But 267 was beefy back then. And Mick Tingelhoff weighed like 237. So you had like a 30-pound advantage on. And look, Mick Tingelhoff is in the Hall of Fame. He ain't no slouch of a player. But he had a 30-pound disadvantage in that game. And that's a big part of the 3-4. And we aren't going to be in that big of an extreme. I mean, I don't know. You might have a big like size advantage nowadays on between like nose tackle and center, but the center is kind of built to deal with that with his quickness and technique and stuff. He'll know how to deal with that. He'll have been dealing with that in college and stuff. But it's still kind of a similar idea because it still is an advantage. And even though the center knows how to mitigate it, they can't get rid of it entirely. And that advantage, that size advantage, really just wrecked a lot of what the Vikings were trying to do on offense in that first Super Bowl, 1969. Of course, the Chiefs win it, and you can go find all these crazy quotes from Hank Stram about all the cool things they were doing to the Vikings. Now the Vikings were totally turned around. If you're strong of stomach, go do it. I think it's really interesting. But that advantage, that particular thing, that 3-4 versus a small center deal, kind of matters right now. And it makes a lot of sense for what the Vikings are doing right now. And so that kind of leads me to that. Look, it's also Monday. Don't think I forgot. It's Mock Draft Monday. So I'm going to talk about that too here on the Locked On Vikings podcast. But first, let me talk to you about the best tasting protein bar on the planet. Built Bar is absolutely delicious, covered in 100% chocolate. Look, this weekend, your boy was moving, and that's excruciating. So you best believe Built Bar 2 kept me going this weekend because they're not like a sugary candy bar. It's not like popping a Snickers and trying to like get a whole day worth out of that. This thing's chock full of 17 grams of protein, but only like 4 grams of sugar, only like 30 calories. Compare that to a candy bar that's got like 300 calories and like 30 grams of sugar, and you're like making a mistake, especially if you're trying to be good, you're trying to lose or maintain weight. Built Bar's got you covered. They also have their Built Bar Puff that is absolutely delicious. It's a marshmallowy one. They've got like a marshmallow churro thing. It's like a cinnamon marshmallow. It's super, super tasty. I have no idea how they made a marshmallow. It tastes like marshmallow. Like it's like you're eating a marshmallow bar covered in chocolate, but it's like collagen protein and it's not that bad for you. It's insane. It's magic. Don't miss out. Go to built.com. You can enter promo code LOCKED15, LOCKED15, to get your order 15% off. That's promo code LOCKED15, all one word, to get 15% off of your order at built.com. Hey, Locked On is on YouTube. So Locked On Vikings is on YouTube. Locked On NFL is on YouTube. Go check it out because YouTube's cool and there's visuals and you can see everybody's face and we can laugh at things and graphics. And also sometimes, at least on this show, there's like diagrams and stuff. So check all that out because YouTube's pretty good. Video components pretty good, and I got purple lights. So do that, but also do Locked On NFL on YouTube, which you can find me on Tuesdays there too. So let's talk about the 3-4 and its history. So of course, the 40s was really when it started with those Oklahoma Sooners teams, but it really kind of came into vogue, I think, within the NFL at least. I think it really came into vogue in the AFL because there was a lot of reverses going on. There was a lot of varied formation things, a lot of spread out things. The AFL, if you watch old AFL games, they look like weirdly modern. Like in terms of the plays these guys do, like it's all black and white, 35 millimeter film, but it all looks really modern. And so it kind of makes sense to me that the 3-4 defenses that everybody's adopting now, these Vic Fangio style things that are a way adapted version of the 3-4, but the principles at least made sense against those kind of weirdly modern AFL offenses. And like Curly Culp, who plenty good player in his own right, like 4 All-Pros, 6 Pro Bowls, 1 DPOY once. Plenty good player as a nose tackle, but Mick Tingelhoff's a Hall of Famer and has all the accolades of himself, right? Like that should not be a blowout of a matchup, but because of the size advantage it was. And Look, in the NFL, in pass protection in the 1960s and 70s, center was, somebody called it, I want to say it was Bud Grant, called it was kind of optional. Or maybe it was Joe Cap. Called it like an optional blocker. Really, in pass protection, your tackles and your guards were doing it, and the center would kind of look for work. And in an ideal protection scenario, that's kind of how it worked out. And honestly, in today's NFL, it's sort of similar. It's just sometimes the guard ends up looking for work or whatever. But in the NFL back then, the center did not need to be like an adept pass protector. And with the AFL, he did need to be, because you had Curly Culps everywhere. So Mick Tingelhoff just wasn't ready to do that. And he just wasn't equipped to do that. It's just what it was a mismatch, plain and simple. That's how it is. Mick Tingelhoff, Hall of Famer. Nobody is questioning how good he was, but it was a mismatch. And that, it's so much more extreme than it would ever be in today's NFL, because 3-4 defenses are everywhere, and everybody kind of understands, look, sometimes you're going to go, like at some point in everybody's season, they go up against a big burly, zero technique, Haloti Nada type. Everybody has to do it, and everybody has to draft for it and be ready for it. Not so much back then, where the Vikings only played NFL teams until the actual Super Bowl, which they had 1 week to prepare for. They didn't have the 2-week thing that we have now. They had 1 week to prepare for it, and they obviously didn't build their team for it. They built their team in the NFL, where nobody was doing that, where everybody had, 1 techniques and 3 techniques and classic 4-3 setups, where they would attack guards and tackles, and the center kind of would just be like the sort of extra guy. And that meant that Curly Culp could wreak a lot of havoc. And he did in that game, in the 1969 game. And what we have today is very similar. Look, offensive linemen are getting smaller. And the reason offensive linemen are getting smaller is not a demand thing, it's a supply thing. In the high school ranks, if you're a big burly athlete and you have a chance, you're good enough to feel like you have a chance at the NFL, you're playing nose tackle, man. The money is that nose tackle and defensive line, not offensive line and center and guard. Those guys are getting stiffed. So the money is in the interior defensive line positions versus the interior offensive line positions. So if you're the kind of kid who thinks maybe if they go to college and they do well there, and then they can go to the pros, and they're 17 years old and thinking about it, and they can decide, when you're in high school, you can still kind of decide, I think I want to play this position, that position. They're going to go with the defensive one. And that means that the offensive linemen end up not attracting as many big kids. So big NFL caliber athlete kids are going to end up on the defensive line more often than the offensive line. And the offensive line sort of doesn't get the same level of athletic talent. This has been going on for a long enough time that everybody's offensive line is bad. The Vikings have been particularly bad. Don't misconstrue this as a way of me saying like the Vikings actually aren't bad at O-line, because everybody is. No, the Vikings have been particularly bad at it. And I think Spielman had some problems there that I've gone over in previous episodes. The Spielman-Zimmer era had problems there that super contributed to them getting fired. But it is an issue that persists across the league to some degree. Everybody is dealing with this. There's just not that good of a talent pool of big, burly, strong offensive linemen. They just don't make them like that anymore. And I think that really set in around 2016, 2017. And I don't think it's a coincidence that in 2018, a pure wide zone team in the McVay Rams went to the Super Bowl. And then in 2019, pure wide zone team, Kyle Shanahan, 49ers go to the Super Bowl. And that sort of started the wave of McVay-Shanahan teams. And a big reason for that is because the wide zone can be run with these smaller linemen. These are the linemen you're dealing with. These are the guys coming out. And so if you can find a way to use them, you're going to have an advantage over teams that can't find a way to use them. But then that kind of defines the metagame of the NFL. And that the NFL if the NFL has a lot of wide zone schemes, that means these 3-4 defenses are going to do better. And if they do better, everyone's going to want to copy it. And here's where the Vikings are. So all of this is to say, this is a really long-winded way of saying Michael Pierce is a really good scheme fit. You need a big boy. everybody's center is tiny because you only ever find tiny centers. And if everybody has a tiny center, having a gigantic nose tackle is going to only become a bigger and bigger advantage as time goes on. So that's, I guess, the point of this whole story is that the Vikings switching to a 3-4 and putting Michael Pierce there feels like a pretty good thing because of where the NFL is at. But I think understanding the history of that is also pretty cool. With all this in mind, let's put a pin in it. And I want to talk about mock draft Monday. But before we do that, let me talk to you about a good old Gramble. It's not football season, and that's sad. But there's other sports, I guess. There's basketball. There's hockey. There could be baseball if they get it together. But I guess you could bet like win totals or like futures or whatever with Bet Online. You can bet on like golf or tennis or MMA or even your favorite Vegas casino games. Head on over to betonline.net. It is your one-stop shop for all news, scores, odds, whatever you want. Head on over, do that, and get yourself a rambling. Betonline.net, where the game starts. All right, so it's Mock Draft Monday. And that means we're going to do a mock draft. I'm using the Pro Football Network mock simulator. If this is your first time, here's a few rules. I am sort of just playing by ear if I want to deal with trades today or not. Today is a day where I do not feel like dealing with trades, so I'm not going to do trades. We'll keep it simple today. Mostly these mock drafts are a way to kind of get to know the board a little bit, and I just reintroduced rounds 2 and 3. So we're doing 3-round mock draft using the Pro Football Network simulator, and the rule is I cannot draft anybody that I have drafted in a previous mock draft. So I've taken Devin Lloyd, and I've taken Chris Olave, and I've taken Derek Stingley. All these guys are off limits. I cannot take them. And you know what? I have been yelled at about this guy forever. This is a dude that has been on the top of Vikings fans' lists forever, and I'm going to just do it. It totally betrays a core meme of the Locked On Vikings podcast, which is Garrett Bradbury propaganda, but I'm going to take Tyler Linderbaum. The Linderbaum obsession among Vikings fans is kind of funny because he's a lot like Garrett Bradbury. He's very fluid. He is very very fast and quick, and he has like a weight issue. He isn't as extreme as Bradbury. Bradbury coming out was like very extreme on this. His strength issue was a lot worse, but his upside was a lot better. Linderbaum's a lot more of a conservative version of that. It's a little bit more reasonable here, and his highs are just as high. He's still got the same wrestling background, and he still has the smarts and the football intelligence, and that's a huge thing. The ability to pick up stunts and all that stuff is absolutely gigantic. Reliable snapper, all of that stuff. It's just that he could probably use a little extra bulk, and that's kind of just who he is. And he's also only been a center for a couple of years, so you've got to deal with that as well. So all of that said, he does seem like a little bit more of a versatile option. If I wanted to take Garrett Bradbury and all of his strengths and put a little bit of bulk on him and make him a more versatile offensive lineman, that guy would probably look like a lot more like Tyler Linderbaum. So I am taking him. OC out of Iowa. Let's take Tyler Linderbaum and let's see what comes up at the Vikings' next pick. A big reason that I'm doing this is to kind of get a lay of the land. And what I'm getting at number 12, even though I took Linderbaum there, is that you kind of can take whatever position you want. But it's so abundant that you probably shouldn't be thinking about this with regard to just position. I don't think you should look at it, and teams certainly don't do this, and so that means you shouldn't either. They don't look at it as, well, they need a wide receiver, so I'm going to take the best wide receiver, or they need a guard, I'm going to take the best guard. They need an edge, I'm going to take the best edge. Best corner, take that. I'm not doing that. So what I'm getting at is, think a little bit more in people and a little bit less in positions. With that in mind, let's think in positions for a second. Just for a second, all right? As I have expanded this, what I'm starting to learn in all the mock drafts I've done, the practice mocks and stuff, is that quarterback in the second round, there's always one of these guys. And there's some, I think a lot of people have started to say that this is a the draft of like 6 QB3s, but there's not a QB1 or a QB2 in it. There's just a lot of like kind of good, kind of not great, kind of sort of dudes. One of those guys is Carson Strong, and he's the only one on the board here. But there seems to always be 1 or 2 of them left. So if you look at this group of like 5 or 6 quarterbacks, Malik Willis, Sam Howell, Kenny Pickett, Carson Strong, whoever else you want to put in there, look at that group of people. And if you think that they're all kind of whatever, they sort of could take or leave any of them. And if you think they're even enough, and if you think they're all guys that I would take them in the second round, but not the first. What I'm finding about this board, someone's always there in the second and not the first. Like there's always somebody. And so if you just want to spend a second rounder on a quarterback and just take a swing like that, it's hard to make that your like actual plan. But the way the Vikings are approaching this, they're keeping Kirk Cousins in house, and to do that, you're going to have to do an extension. And there's a very, very small chance that that extension is like flexible at all this year or next. So taking a second round quarterback is kind of a mixed bag, where the Vikings aren't planning to do this, and it would be awkward to transition to that quarterback if he works out. And that does mitigate the value of that. Although, of course, it's not a reason to like not do it. It's just a little awkward. But it's also like, we have Kirk Cousins. Maybe let's think about one of the edges that are available down here, or a linebacker or something. So it's something. But I am going to take Carson Strong. He has all the physical traits. He has the size you want. One of these big, burly, kind of hard to tackle sort of quarterbacks. He's got a good arm and all that stuff. He's reasonable enough as an athlete. He's good at execution. With the third round pick, I'm going to take somebody everybody's going to like. Let's take the 380-pound offensive tackle. I don't care that the Vikings have Brian O'Neill and Christian Darrisaw in the room. Put somebody at guard. I don't care. Let's do Daniel Faalele. He's 380 pounds. He's a tackle. He's huge, and he's a gopher. Everybody can get behind this. So here's the deal. Usually with these guys that are like too big for the position, that, you give me a 500-pound person, that guy can't move and every edge rusher can run around him. But Faalele is too broad and he moves way better than he has any right to at his size. And then his size makes him completely immovable. That's the entire point of him. So let's take this guy. We'll put him at a tackle position, or maybe put him at a guard position, right? Let's get that guy up against the nose tackle. We'll put the dude in the dirt. I don't care where you put this guy. Get him on your line, and then let's really lean into the whole deal about like protecting Kirk Cousins and everything like that. So I'm taking Daniel Faalele. I don't know, man. This is a pretty fun mock draft. We got him. We got Carson Strong, and we got a center. We got a guard. We got 2 offensive linemen and Carson Strong. We have an insane offensive line looking here. I feel like this is exactly the kind of draft that a lot of Vikings fans are going to want come draft day. But I don't know. Let me know what you think and send me your own mock drafts. Also, send me your questions, because tomorrow is Twitter Tuesday here on the Locked On Vikings podcast. So send them to me, Locked On Vikings on Twitter, Luke Braun NFL on Twitter. Send an email to lockedonvikingspodcast@gmail.com if you want. Or, of course, there's always the Google form, which is always down in the show notes. So you can check that out as well. In the meantime, check out the Locked On NFL Draft podcast for more NFL draft content that's taken a lot more seriously than my February mock drafts, but they'll get more serious in the future, I promise. But in the meantime, check out the Locked On NFL Draft podcast. I will see you all tomorrow. And as always, Skol.